Greetings and welcome to video 2 on lesson 6.1, page 216, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to start off in this video now by taking these percents and we're going to write them as fractions. And of course, all fractions need to be simplified. So we got to put them in simplest form. You should never leave a fraction as a final answer that's not simplified at this point. There are going to be some times that we may do that. But right now, unless told otherwise, you will always simplify your fractions. So, ladies and gentlemen, it doesn't have any of these directions in the book. Maybe you remember them from elementary, but we're refreshing our brains. So I'm going to tell them to you. I'm going to write them down. You're going to look, you're going to listen, you're going to learn, and then you're going to pause the video and write them down yourself. There's only 3 things you got to remember to do. And that's number 1, we're going to drop the percent sign. Number 2, write the number over 100, because all percents are out of 100. When we write it out of 100, we're not changing what we have. We still have the percent. And then we're going to, of course, simplify. However, we're going to treat it like a fraction when we simplify it. And we got to remember that fractions are special numbers. All right, go ahead and pause the video, write those down, and then join me for our examples. Okay, example number 11, 45%. First thing we're going to do is drop the percent sign and write the number 45. And then we're going to write it over 100. And now, of course, we're going to simplify. We recognize that I can divide by 5 to rewrite the fraction with a new name with the same value. We're not changing the value at all. And we get 9 over 20. So 9/20 is the fraction that when, if we turn that into a decimal and then turn that into a percent, we would get 45%. Or if we multiplied that denominator by a compatible number, which would be 5, to get 100, of course, we would have 45%. Example number 12, 67%. So we're going to drop the percent sign, write the number over 100, and I'm looking at that, and I cannot simplify that. We're done. That's simple. We're done. Go ahead and pause the video and write those 2 down. Join us for examples 13 and 14. So here we are in example 13 and 14. We got 2.5%. So ladies and gentlemen, 2.5%. I'm going to take that number, 2.5. I'm dropping the percent sign. I'm writing it over 100. Now, this is a fraction. And fractions are very specific when we talk about the numerator and the denominator. In a fraction, if we were calling this a fraction and treating it as such, we cannot have decimals in our numerators or our denominators. Okay. Now there's a couple ways of taking care of that. I'm going to take care of it by multiplying by a number that will create a whole number out of that decimal. I recognize that 2.5, if I double that, if I multiply it by 2, I will get 5. So if I multiply 100 by 2, I get 200. So now I can take that and it's much easier to simplify. And of course I would divide by 5 and I'd get a final answer of 1/40 as my fraction in simplest form. There are some people who say, hey, I've got to move that decimal one place, so I'm going to multiply by a power of 10 to move it 1. So if I multiplied by 10 and I got 25 over 1,000, that would still be 1 over 40. You can still simplify that just the same. So it all depends on what you recognize as your math facts. Moving on to 14, 255%. Going to drop that decimal sign, 255 over 100. And I'm going to turn it into a fraction. I have to simplify. Well, first thing I know is that is an improper fraction. And I know that 100 goes into 255 2 times with 55 left over. Now I'm going to simplify the 55 over 100. Again, seems like we're dividing by 5 all the time. But that would be 2 and 11, and that would be 20ths. 2 and 11 20ths. Go ahead and copy those down and join us for our next example. On our next example, ladies and gentlemen, it says describe and correct the error in writing 1.8 as a percent. Two things we have to do. One, describe. Two, correct. So there's two parts to this one. So we're going to come over here, and of course it's telling us this, writing this 1.8 as a percent, that it's not correct. So when we recognize, when we recall that 1.8, that's a decimal, writing it as a percent. I want to multiply it by 100, which says move the decimal 2 places to the right, and then add the percent sign. And I look over here, and I see that they've attempted to move 2 places, but they didn't start in the right spot. They didn't even start at the decimal. So they didn't move, describing the error, did not move decimal correctly. You can get more specific and you can say they didn't move the decimal from where it was, where it started, however you want to say it. But that's good enough. And then of course, if we have 1.8 and we do move that decimal correctly 2 places, we would have to add a 0 and when we put our decimal, and then we say that this would be 180% when we add our percent sign. So describing and correcting, remember, when we do these as on our assignments, it will be worth 2 points because you are doing 2 things. One, describing, and 2, correcting the error. Go ahead and copy that down. I'll see you on example 16. Example 16, real life application. It says, of the fluids that you drink on a typical day, 1/10 is milk and 50% is water. How many times more water do you drink than milk? We're going to learn, ladies and gentlemen, about marking text. Now, we can't mark the text in the book all the time because in the book, we don't want to mark up the book. But anytime we do have an opportunity, we want to mark the text. And marking the text says, going back and reading it a second time. It says, of the fluids that you drink on a typical day, 1/10, that's an important number. I'm circling that by marking the text, is milk and 50% is water. All right. My question says, how many times more water do you drink than milk? Well, how many more times? I'm multiplying by something. What am I doing? I'm multiplying my milk to get my water. Because how many times more water? So I take my milk, 1/10. I'm multiplying it by some number. How many times to get my 50% of what I drink each day as being milk? Now I look at that and I'm like, first thing I've got to understand, we haven't talked about equations yet because we just wrote an equation. Before we can do anything with these, we've got to have numbers in the same form. We can't have fractions and percents. We want to change them to the same form. I can change my 1/10 into a percent, but we don't do math with percents. We always change our percents to decimals. So the easiest thing to do would be to change both of them to a percent. And 1/10 is 0.1. If you can say the fraction, you can say the decimal. 1/10, that's 0.1, 1/10. Times some number, and 50% as a decimal would be 0.5. Moving that decimal 2 places to the left by dividing by 100. Now I got to say to myself, what do I multiply by 0.1 to get 0.5? And I recognize when we learn how to solve equations, we would be dividing 0.1 by 0.5 to find out how many more times. And our final answer will result in 5 times more water than milk. So 5 times. How many times more? 5 times more. Make sense? I hope so. Go ahead and copy that down and join me for our last example of the night. Number 17 says only 0.15 or only 1/1500ths of the total number of vehicles in your school parking lot are buses. What percent of the vehicles are buses? So I go back and read a second time and mark the text. Only 1/1500ths of the total number of vehicles in our parking lot are buses. What percent of the vehicles are buses? So I want to write my decimal 0.15 as a percent. 0.15, to write that as a percent, I multiply by 100. Multiplying by 100 moves the decimal 2 places to the right. And my final answer, 15% are buses. 15% are buses. All right, that concludes our notes on lesson 6.1. You have your last quick write. If you have an opportunity, go ahead and copy that entire thing down. You copy that word problem, the story problem out, copy it down into your book for your quick write, and then answer that. We'll go over the answers tomorrow. And of course, remember, ladies and gentlemen, when you go back and look at your notes real quick, please go back, write down any questions that you have regarding what we've talked about with these percents and decimals. Or put a question mark next to or highlight a section of the notes that you feel you need more support on from me. Ladies and gentlemen, if you want, working on your assignment, it's always good to start working on your assignment. But remember, I expect 30 to 45 minutes of math. 45 minutes of math max in a given night. If you get to 45 minutes, you can stop. You can go back and do it in the morning if you want. However, 45 minutes max, using your time efficiently. One thing that's helpful, if you just do a couple questions, even just a couple, sometimes those questions will create it within you questions to ask Mr. Ross. Always important to ask questions. Please, please, please asking questions. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been a fantastic night. Please finish your quick write, and I will see you tomorrow with questions that you have when we revisit our notes. Thank you so much for your time. I'll see you tomorrow.